The whispers in room 307. The first time Sarah heard the whispers, she was certain they were coming from the air vent. It made sense. The old apartment building had paper-thin walls, and sounds traveled in strange ways through the ancient ductwork. But when she pressed her ear against the cool metal grate, the whispers stopped abruptly, as if aware they were being observed. Just the neighbors, she told herself, ignoring the prickle of unease that crept up her spine. Nothing to worry about. Sarah had moved into apartment 307 just 3 weeks ago, desperate for affordable housing after her divorce. The building itself was unremarkable, a 6-story brick structure built in the 1930s, with creaking floors and temperamental plumbing. The rent was suspiciously cheap for this part of the city, but Sarah wasn't in a position to question good fortune. That night, she dreamed of standing in her bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Except it wasn't quite her reflection. The woman in the mirror was smiling slightly, while Sarah was not. When Sarah raised her hand, the reflection remained still for a fraction of a second before mimicking the movement. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding against her ribs, the sensation of being watched lingering like a bad aftertaste. The following morning, Mrs. Greeley from 309 caught her in the hallway. The elderly woman had lived in the building for over 40 years and seemed to consider herself the unofficial historian and welcoming committee. "Getting settled in, dear?" she asked, her rheumy eyes scanning Sarah's face with uncomfortable intensity. "Yes, thank you. It's coming along." Mrs. Greeley nodded, clutching her cardigan closed at her throat. "That's good. Some folks don't last long in 307. Too sensitive, I suppose." Sarah forced a smile. "Oh? Well, I've always been pretty practical." "That's what the last tenant said." Mrs. Greeley's voice dropped to a whisper. "Found her sleeping in the hallway 3 nights in a row before she broke her lease. Said she couldn't stand the voices." A chill skittered down Sarah's back. "Voices? Oh, just building noises, I'm sure. These old walls." Mrs. Greeley patted Sarah's arm with a papery hand. "Don't mind me. I'm sure you'll be just fine." As the elevator doors closed between them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Greeley knew something she didn't. That evening, Sarah came home later than usual, having buried herself in work at the office. The hallway was dimly lit, one of the fluorescent bulbs flickering erratically. She fumbled with her keys, acutely aware of the silence pressing in around her. The whispers started again the moment she switched off the living room light. This time, they seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves, a frantic, urgent susurration that rose and fell, like fevered breathing. Sarah turned the light back on, and the whispers ceased immediately. "Hello?" she called out, feeling ridiculous. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. She left the light on that night, telling herself it was because she needed to get up early and didn't want to stumble in the dark. The truth was, she couldn't bear the thought of what might happen when the room went black. The dreams intensified. Each night, she found herself in different parts of the apartment, watching her reflection behave with subtle autonomy. In the most disturbing dream, her reflection reached out, pressing its palm against the glass, as if trying to break through. During daylight hours, Sarah began to research the building's history. The local library yielded little information beyond a few newspaper clippings about its construction and renovation in the 1970s. Nothing sinister, nothing that would explain the growing unease that had taken root in her chest. A week later, Sarah came home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her heart leapt into her throat. Had she been robbed? But when she cautiously entered, nothing seemed out of place. Her laptop still sat on the coffee table. The TV remained mounted on the wall. The only difference was a small, water-stained cardboard box sitting in the center of her kitchen table. She was certain it hadn't been there when she left that morning. Inside the box was a collection of Polaroid photographs, yellowed with age. With trembling fingers, Sarah spread them across the table. Each photo showed the same thing. Apartment 307, her apartment, but from decades past. Different furniture, different decor, but unmistakably the same space. What made her breath catch was the recurring detail in each photo. A mirror or reflective surface capturing the image of whoever lived there. In every reflection, just over the tenant's shoulder, was the blurry outline of someone else. Someone who wasn't visible in the room itself. Sarah dropped the photos as if they'd burned her. As they scattered across the floor, she noticed writing on the back of one. In faded blue ink, someone had scrawled, "It starts with whispers, then it wants to wear you." That night, she couldn't bring herself to stay in the apartment. She checked into a hotel downtown, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that old buildings had quirks, and her imagination was simply running wild. The hotel room was sterile and anonymous, with bland, abstract art and a bathroom mirror she covered with a towel. She slept dreamlessly for the first time in weeks. When Sarah returned to apartment 307 the next day, the box of photographs was gone. She searched every cabinet, every drawer, but found no trace of its existence. Had she imagined it? Was stress finally taking its toll on her sanity? The thought had barely formed when she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting across the bathroom doorway. She froze, listening. The apartment was silent, but it was a thick, expectant silence, like the held breath before a scream. "Who's there?" Her voice sounded thin and frightened in the empty apartment. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, the vents, the walls, even from beneath the floorboards. Sarah pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound wormed its way into her head regardless. And then amid the unintelligible murmuring, she caught a single phrase repeated over and over. "Let me in, Sarah, let me in." She ran to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, avoiding her reflection in the mirror. As she reached for a towel, she noticed something dark in the sink. Hair. Long strands of black hair, too long to be her own, circling the drain. With shaking hands, she pulled one strand free. It was at least 12 inches long. Her hair barely reached her shoulders. The bathroom mirror fogged suddenly, despite the lack of hot water. Sarah watched in horror as words formed in the condensation, written by an invisible finger. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah stumbled backward, nearly falling into the bathtub. The fog on the mirror dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, taking the message with it. That night, Sarah invited a friend to stay over. Megan arrived with a bottle of wine and enough skepticism to make Sarah feel slightly less unhinged. "So you think your apartment is haunted?" Megan asked, settling onto the couch with her glass of Pinot Noir. Sarah winced at the blunt phrasing. "I didn't say haunted exactly. Just, there are things happening that I can't explain." "Like what?" "Whispers, dreams, and yesterday I found—" Sarah stopped. How could she explain the box of photographs that had vanished without a trace? "I found hair in the sink, long black hair." Megan raised an eyebrow. "Previous tenants? This building doesn't exactly scream thorough cleaning between renters." "Maybe," Sarah conceded, though she didn't believe it. They stayed up late watching mindless reality TV, and Sarah began to relax. The apartment felt different with Megan there, warmer, safer. By midnight, they were both yawning, and Sarah set up the pull-out couch for her friend. "Bathroom's all yours," Sarah said, handing Megan a towel. "I'm going to turn in." Sleep came mercifully quickly, but it didn't last. Sarah woke sometime later to the sound of whispers, not from the vents or walls this time, but from right beside her bed. She lay perfectly still, eyes squeezed shut, unwilling to look. The mattress dipped slightly, as if someone had sat down on the edge. "Megan?" she whispered, voice trembling. No response, but the whispers continued, more distinct now, multiple voices, overlapping, pleading. "Let us in. We've been waiting so long." A cold hand brushed against her cheek. Sarah screamed, flinging herself out of bed and fumbling for the light switch. The room flooded with harsh fluorescent light, revealing nothing. She was alone. "Megan," she called out, rushing to the living room. The pull-out couch was empty, the sheets rumpled but cold. The bathroom door stood ajar, dark and silent. "Megan?" Sarah checked every room, growing more frantic with each empty space she encountered. There was no sign of her friend. As she returned to the living room, her gaze fell on the decorative mirror hanging above the couch. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. Her reflection stood unnaturally still, watching her with a slight smile that didn't match her own expression of horror. And behind her reflection, barely visible in the dim light, stood other figures, hazy, translucent forms with hollow eyes and grasping hands. But what sent Sarah stumbling backward with a choked cry was the figure standing at the forefront of this ghostly crowd. Megan, her eyes vacant, her mouth moving in sync with the whispers that now filled the apartment. Sarah ran. She didn't stop to grab her phone, or keys, or wallet. She simply ran, barefoot in her pajamas, down the hallway to the stairwell. As she fled down the stairs, she could hear the whispers pursuing her, hungry and desperate. "Come back, Sarah. We need you. We need your skin." She burst into the lobby, startling the night doorman from his doze. "Call the police," she gasped. "My friend, apartment 307. Something's happened to her." The doorman, an older man named Ellis who had worked in the building for decades, gave her a long, sad look. "Nobody came in with you tonight, Miss Taylor," he said gently. "I've been here since 4. You came in alone." "That's impossible. My friend Megan. Would you like me to call someone for you?" "A family member, perhaps." Sarah stared at him, the horrible truth beginning to dawn on her. "How long have you worked here, Ellis?" He seemed surprised by the question. Going on 30 years now. And apartment 307, has anyone ever reported problems with it? Ellis's eyes slid away from hers. I'm not supposed to discuss other tenants. Please, Sarah begged. I think I'm in danger. After a long moment, Ellis sighed. That apartment has always been difficult to rent long-term. People move out quickly. Sometimes they make claims about voices or seeing things that aren't there. And the mirrors? Sarah whispered. Ellis's face paled. How did you know about that? Before he could answer, the lobby lights flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, Sarah heard the whispers again, closer now, surrounding her. We found you. When the emergency lights came on a few seconds later, Ellis was staring at her with an expression of pure terror. Your reflection, he choked out. It's not. Sarah turned slowly toward the lobby's decorative mirror. Her reflection smiled back at her, but now it was flanked by dozens of others, men, women, children, all with the same hungry look in their eyes. And as she watched in frozen horror, her reflection reached out, pressing its palm against the glass. The surface rippled like disturbed water, and a hand emerged, grasping, seeking. Sarah screamed as cold fingers brushed against her wrist. The last thing she heard before consciousness fled was Ellis's horrified exclamation and the triumphant chorus of whispers. Finally, a way out. When Sarah woke in the hospital 2 days later, the doctors told her she had suffered some kind of breakdown. Ellis had called an ambulance after she collapsed in the lobby, talking frantically about whispers and reflections coming to life. Stress-induced psychosis, the psychiatrist suggested, combined with sleep deprivation. Sarah nodded and agreed to take the prescribed medication. What else could she do? Tell them that something was living in the mirrors of apartment 307, that it had taken her friend. A friend who, according to her phone records and social media, didn't seem to exist. She was released a week later with instructions to follow up with outpatient therapy. She never returned to apartment 307. The building manager was surprisingly understanding, allowing her to break the lease without penalty. It happens, he said with a shrug, not meeting her eyes. Sarah moved to a small town on the coast, renting a cottage with windows that faced the ocean. She removed all mirrors from her new home and covered reflective surfaces with cloth. On her nightstand sits a jar of salt and a silver knife. Traditional protections she'd researched obsessively during her recovery. She still hears the whispers sometimes, especially on foggy nights when the windows turn into black mirrors after sunset. And occasionally from the corner of her eye, she catches glimpses of familiar faces watching her from puddles and polished surfaces, hollow-eyed specters with her friend Megan always at the front, mouth moving in silent pleas. But most disturbing of all is what happened 2 months after she fled apartment 307. While grocery shopping in her new town, Sarah saw a familiar face, her own, on a woman entering the store. The woman had Sarah's face, Sarah's walk, Sarah's voice as she greeted the cashier. But her eyes, when they briefly met Sarah's across the produce section, were empty and wrong. The woman smiled, a knowing smile that didn't reach those hollow eyes, and whispered words Only Sarah could hear. "Thank you for letting us in." Sarah ran again. She's still running, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to be noticed. She avoids reflections of all kinds and sleeps with the lights on. And she writes warnings, hundreds of them, leaving them in library books and on community bulletin boards. If you hear whispers from inside your walls, don't listen. They only want one thing, to wear you, and they're spreading.